If you had to choose between protecting what you've built your whole life or risking everything for the truth, which path would you take? Welcome to Happiness of Love, your daily dose of K-dramas. Get ready to fall in love with unforgettable stories. Can you tell us where are you listening from? Rain was battering Edinburgh that night, but inside the towering McGregor Museum of Art and History, the real hurricane was about to explode. William McGregor entered the main hall with firm steps, his wet shoes echoing on the marble floor. His icy gaze swept the space until he found the figure of Kate Sinclair, standing in front of the large Renaissance canvas exposed in the center of the room. She was distracted, her eyes shining with that intensity he was already beginning to recognize, not of admiration, but of defiance. He said his name, and Kate turned around, surprised to see him there so late. The satisfied smile that touched his lips for a moment disappeared the moment William held up the printed copy of an article. The paper trembled in his hand, but not from insecurity, from pure fury. Her voice cut through the silence of the museum when she asked if she really believed she could ruin her name with irresponsible publishing. Kate crossed her arms, keeping her posture firm. The smell of rain still permeated William's suit, and she noticed the furious glint in his eyes. But he would not give in. She responded by saying that she had not published any lies. The piece was a forgery, and the facts were there, clear as day. William stepped forward, anger simmering in his voice as he asked her if she had any idea what she had done. On the other side of the room, the watchful eyes of the security guards watched them, uncertain whether they should intervene. Kate lifted her chin, refusing to back down. He said that the problem was not that she had revealed the truth, but that he had allowed such an obvious fraud to be part of his collection. The muscle in William's jaw contracted. Never, in all his years as director of the museum, had anyone dared to challenge him in that way. Did she know the weight of her words? Did you know what it meant to accuse a McGregor of allowing a fraud in his own home? Kate kept her gaze steady, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. It was not fear. It was adrenaline. The way William stared at her, so close now that she could see the glow of the storm reflected in his blue eyes, caused every nerve in her body to light up. He said that if she had any decency, he would retract that statement immediately. Kate laughed, a short, humorless laugh. Retract? Never. She replied that she would not sell her integrity at a desperate request from someone who did not want to face the truth. William clenched his jaw, his fingers crumpling the paper he still held. So it was like that. He realized that this woman was not like the academics who bowed to her influence. She was a problem. And a problem he couldn't ignore. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with electricity. William closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before saying that if she didn't back down, he would make sure she never had a place in the world of archaeology again. Kate felt a shiver go up her spine, but instead of shaking, she stepped forward, dangerously invading his space. He said that if he tried, he would make a point of exposing every detail of this fraud to the world. The museum's clock chimed, marking the end of the hour. The sound echoed in the empty room, but neither of them moved. The challenge between them was sealed. William narrowed his eyes, assessing her, feeling for the first time that he might have found a worthy opponent. Then, without saying anything else, he turned and left, leaving behind the smell of rain and arrogance. Kate took a deep breath, feeling her fingers quiver. She knew it wouldn't end there. I could hardly imagine what was coming. By the next morning, the news had spread like wildfire in a dry field. William McGregor's name was plastered in international headlines, associated with a scandal that threatened the untouchable reputation of the McGregor Museum of Art and History. In the luxurious office on the top floor of the museum, he stood motionless in front of the glass wall, looking out over the grey landscape of Edinburgh. The coffee on his desk cooled untouched, while his cell phone vibrated incessantly with calls from investors and board members demanding explanations. The humiliation burned under her skin, but more than that, an uncomfortable feeling settled in her chest. Kate Sinclair could be right. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment before ordering his assistant to come in. The woman hesitated before asking if he would like them to start a press release denying the allegations. He opened a cold, short and humorless smile, saying that he would not stoop to a public denial. Not yet. First, he needed to deal with the source of the problem. On the other side of town, Kate was flipping through notes in her small office at the university, still not believing the proportion her article had taken. With each update on her cell phone, new comments from the scientific community appeared, some applauding her courage, others questioning whether she was fully sure of what she had said. But she had no doubts. Analysis of the piece revealed discrepancies impossible to ignore, modern traces in pigmentation, artificial microcracks to simulate aging, details that someone with the right knowledge could mask but not fool a meticulous observer like her. The abrupt noise of the door opening made her body react even before her mind processed whoever had entered. William McGregor was there, a storm contained in a perfectly lined suit, the woody scent mixed with the cold smell of the air he carried with him. He closed the door with forced calm, his eyes staring at her with a sharp intensity, and said he hoped she was satisfied. Kate crossed her arms, feeling her heart race, but keeping her posture firm as she replied that her only goal was the truth. He approached slowly, his gaze studying every detail of his expression, as if looking for a gap, a hesitation, anything that would give him an advantage. But all he found was conviction. William rested his hands on her desk, leaning in enough for her to feel the tension emanating from him when he told her that she had no idea of the consequences of what she had done. Kate lifted her chin, fighting back without blinking that it wasn't she who should worry about the consequences, but him. The teasing made something shine in his eyes, something between anger and admiration? But it was impossible. He would never admit it. The silence between the two was so dense that it almost became palpable. The clock on the wall ticked the seconds with rhythmic beats, and Kate felt her pulse quicken as he pulled away just enough to straighten his posture. He then said, with calculated coolness, that he had a proposal. If she was so convinced that her analysis was unquestionable, then she should have been brave enough to prove it in person. He offered full access to the museum's records and the pieces in question, but on one condition: she would work directly with him on the investigation to get to the truth. Kate blinked, processing the words. Working with William McGregor? In the heart of the storm that she herself had provoked? The idea was as absurd as it was dangerous, but before he could refuse, he stepped forward, stating that if she didn't accept it, then her credibility would be nothing more than an illusion. A challenge. He was testing how far she would go, hoping she'd back off, hoping she'd hesitate. But she wouldn't. Feeling the weight of the choice, Kate took a deep breath, holding her gaze on his for a moment before saying she would accept. A flash of something indecipherable crossed William's face, but in the blink of an eye it disappeared, replaced by the same impassive air as always. He said he hoped she was prepared, because the truth was always more complicated than you think. Kate felt a shiver run down her spine. I was sure that this was the beginning of something that would change everything. The halls of the McGregor Museum of Art and History were quieter than usual, but the tension in the air made it impossible to ignore the unseen chaos unfolding behind the scenes. Inside the private meeting room, William McGregor maintained his rigid posture in front of the impeccably arranged mahogany table, while on the other side, the board members argued in muffled voices about the crisis that was taking place. Investors were reconsidering their contributions, sponsors were demanding clarification, and even big-name collectors were beginning to doubt the museum's credibility. The mere fact that a question had been raised was poison, and William knew he needed to nip the problem in the bud before it spread. But worst of all, he knew that the only way to reverse this situation required something he could never have imagined doing: working side by side with Kate Sinclair. The murmur of surrounding voices dissolved as he stood, adjusting his cufflinks with meticulous precision before stating that he would take the reins of the investigation himself. The decision caused surprised looks to cross around the table, but no one dared to question him. If there was one thing William McGregor did masterfully, it was to maintain control, and even if, inside, a part of him seethed with frustration at depending on the woman who had started this storm, he would not show weakness. In the late afternoon, the sound of the fine rain against the museum's stained glass windows accompanied Kate's determined steps through the corridors. Every detail of the place was a masterpiece: the marble pillars, the ornate ceilings, the lighting strategically placed to bring the pieces on display to life. But none of this impressed her more than the presence that awaited her in the center of the great hall. William was there, impeccable as ever, his eyes fixed on the play that had started it all. He turned slowly as he perceived her arrival, and what followed was an instant of pure silent clash. Neither of them wanted to be there, but fate had sealed the perfect trap, forcing them to live together and collaborate. William broke the silence first, saying that he had prepared a space on the upper floor where they could conduct the analysis without outside interference. Kate arched an eyebrow, feeling the sarcasm in her own voice as she asked if that meant he finally accepted the possibility that something was wrong inside his precious museum. He didn't answer immediately, just moved his gaze to the piece before them, and for a brief moment, Kate could almost see past the usual layer of arrogance. It wasn't just wounded pride. There was something else, a weight that he carried, and that, until then, she had not noticed. But before he could explore this idea, William resumed his usual stance, saying that his only interest was to resolve this situation before more damage was done. Kate followed her steps through the museum to a more restricted corridor, where an armored door opened after a digital recognition. The environment inside the security safe was unlike anything she had seen so far: controlled air conditioning, special lighting to preserve the works, files organized on tempered glass shelves. In the center, a long table was already prepared with documents, purchase records, restoration reports, and, of course, the painting wrapped in a protective dome. She approached slowly, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end as she stared at the piece so closely. The last time he had stood before her, her analysis had been enough to cause an earthquake in the art world, and now, she had a chance to prove her right. William stood on the other side of the table, arms crossed, watching her every move like a predator studying its prey. Kate took a deep breath before asking him if he was ready to accept the evidence or if he intended to fight the facts to the end. He narrowed his eyes, leaning slightly forward as he said that truth is a more complicated concept than it seems, and that she should be careful what she wanted to find out. The weight of his words hung in the air, hovering between the two as the storm outside gathered strength. Kate knew she was entering dangerous territory, not only because of the investigation itself, but because, for the first time, she felt that William McGregor was not just an adversary. He was an enigma. The environment inside the security vault was quiet, except for the rhythmic sound of Kate's breathing as she reviewed the painting's acquisition records. The cold light from the ceiling reflected off the tempered glass that protected the piece, and the air carried a metallic and sterile smell, typical of places where secrets were under lock and key. William stood on the other side of the table, his eyes fixed on her, his arms crossed, his patience as sharp as the blade of a razor. Kate deliberately ignored that overwhelming presence as her fingers slid across the yellowed pages of the documents, looking for inconsistencies, for any detail that would confirm what she already knew. The problem was that William was watching her every move, waiting for a hesitation, for a mistake, for any failure that would give him the right to say she was wrong. He said it was intriguing to see her so convinced, considering she was treading into dangerous territory. Kate looked up, feeling the irritation boil under her skin as she replied that the truth wasn't dangerous, just inconvenient for those who had something to hide. The teasing caused William to lean forward slightly, the shadow softening the contours of his face but intensifying the coldness of his eyes. He asked her if she really believed that everyone involved in this was guilty or if she just liked the idea of destroying her reputation. Kate held her gaze, feeling the tension vibrate in the air as she said that her intention was never to attack him personally, but if he was so desperate to defend himself, maybe there was a reason for it. The muscle in William's jaw contracted, and Kate realized she had hit something. He looked away for a brief moment, but soon regained control, exhaling slowly before stating that arguing with her was an exercise in futility, for no matter how many facts were on the table, she would still look at him as the villain of this story. Kate broke into a brief, barely noticeable smile as she said that maybe he should consider the possibility that he wasn't always the hero. The silence between the two remained tense as Kate turned her attention to the painting. The colors and strokes were impressive at first glance, but there was something wrong with the surface texture, something that only someone with years of experience could identify. She moved a little closer, gently removing a pocket magnifying glass from her coat and leaning over the table to examine the outer layer of paint. William watched his every movement, his expression impassive, but his gaze betrayed the discomfort. Then, suddenly, a slight imbalance caused Kate to lean reflexively on the edge of the table, and it was at that moment that William's fingers touched hers. The contact lasted less than a second, but it was enough for Kate to feel a shock run through her skin, as if her body recognized something before her mind could even process it. She pulled away slightly, not sure if the gesture had been accidental or deliberate, but the tension that already existed between them seemed to have multiplied. William didn't say anything, just backed away with the same calculated precision as always, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't felt the heat emanating from her skin the same way she felt his. The night wore on, and as the investigation progressed, Kate found herself, against her own will, beginning to see William differently. He wasn't just an arrogant man who refused to admit a mistake. There was something else there, something he protected with an almost irrational obstinacy. And it wasn't until the end of the night, when Kate allowed herself a moment to rest and leaned back in her chair, that she realized that William was still there, motionless, staring at the painting with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was not wounded pride. It was something deeper, something that seemed, for a brief moment, to crumble the insurmountable barrier he had always erected around him. Kate watched him silently, wondering what exactly that painting meant to him. But before he could ask anything, William looked away, ending that moment of vulnerability as if it had never existed. He said it was too late and that they would continue the next day. Kate nodded, but as she left the room, she still felt his presence marked on her skin, she still felt the echo of the look he had given her before turning his back. The soft sound of the clock hand marked the passing of time inside the restricted files room, as Kate slid her fingers across the yellowed sheets of old records. The smell of the aged paper mingled with the subtle scent of leather and wood in the room, and the only other presence there was William, standing beside her, watching her in silence as he analyzed every detail of the documents that he himself hesitated to confront. For days, the investigation had advanced without major discoveries, but now, in the face of the museum's list of acquisitions over the past 10 years, a single repeated signature drew attention. The counterfeit piece had been purchased under the approval of a name William knew well, a name that made something icy spread through his bloodstream. Kate noticed the change in his posture before he even said anything. The rigid body, the gaze that had become a shadowy shadow of something indecipherable, the silence laden with a weight she did not expect to see. She said they finally had something concrete, a real clue that could expose who was behind the scandal and restore the museum's integrity. William remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the name on the paper as if he could somehow change what was there. He closed the briefcase slowly before saying that it would not leave that room. Kate felt the frustration rise like a violent wave. The truth was right there, in his hands, and William wanted to bury it? She asked him if he really expected her to ignore it, to pretend not to have seen it, to condone a crime for the sake of her family's untouchable reputation. William turned to her with a sharp gaze, his voice low and controlled as he said that it was not just about reputation, but about consequences. If that name were revealed, it would not be just a passing scandal. It would be an earthquake, a disaster that would drag more than just one culprit. Kate couldn't believe her ears. Would he really choose to protect someone instead of the truth? The outrage in her voice was palpable as she stated that he was being exactly the kind of man she thought he would be, arrogant, controlling, willing to manipulate any situation to stay on top. William took a step forward, and the intense glint in his eyes revealed that something in him was also about to explode. He said it wasn't that simple, that she had no idea what forces were involved in it, that it wasn't just a matter of right and wrong. Kate refused to back down, the words coming out like a blade as she replied that he was afraid of losing control, afraid of admitting that something bigger was at stake than his own vanity. The air around them was dense, charged with something that was more than anger, more than frustration. It was raw tension, an electric current that pulsed between the two, as if that confrontation was inevitable from the first moment they had met. William opened his mouth to answer, but before he could do so, the door opened, and his assistant's voice echoed through the room, informing him that he needed to prepare for the museum's benefit that night. Kate crossed her arms, her expression hard as she said that this conversation was not over yet. William held her gaze for a long moment before turning around and leaving the room, taking with him the briefcase with the evidence she knew he would try to hide. Night came quickly, and the main hall of the museum was transformed. Gilded chandeliers reflected light in bright patterns on the marble floor, waiters circled with champagne glasses, and impeccably dressed guests chatted under a veil of carefully rehearsed sophistication. Kate watched the scene from a distance, feeling out of place in that world of appearances, but determined not to allow William to silence her. She needed a moment to confront him again, but before she could look for him, she felt a light touch on his elbow, and as she turned, she found herself in front of the evening's own host. William was spotless, his black suit fitted perfectly to his body, his silk tie neatly aligned, but the look he gave her was anything but inviting. He said he didn't expect to see her there and that he imagined that he had already resigned himself to the idea that some truths should remain buried. Kate narrowed her eyes, refusing to be intimidated, replying that if he thought she would give up so easily, then he didn't know her as well as he imagined. Before she could continue, the sound of soft music began to fill the room, and Kate realized too late that she had been taken to the center of the room. Guests began to pair up, and the next thing she felt was William's steady hand gripping her waist, leading her into a dance she hadn't consented to, but from which she couldn't escape. The warmth of his touch ran through the fabric of her dress, and Kate felt her heart race, both from irritation and from something more dangerous, something she didn't want to name. He whispered that if she was determined to challenge a McGregor, then she needed to learn how to play at the same level. She smiled sideways, refusing to budge, saying she would never bow to his rules. The world around them seemed to slow down as their synchronized footsteps moved them around the room. The woody smell of his skin mingled with the delicate perfume Kate wore, and for a single instant, she saw something different in his eyes. A hesitation. A split second in which William McGregor was not the ruthless CEO, but a man in conflict with something that even he didn't seem to understand. And then, as if regaining control at the last moment, he gently spun her around and released her at the end of the dance, the tension still pulsing in the space between the two. Kate knew that this battle was far from over, but for the first time, she had the feeling that she had managed to stir something inside him. The silence of the museum was overwhelming that night, broken only by the sound of the fine rain beating against the windows and the rustle of pages that Kate ran through with anxious fingers. The soft gloom of the research office cast ragged shadows over the papers scattered in front of it, documents that, until a few hours ago, had been hidden in a forgotten section of the museum's archives. Each sheet revealed details that connected like pieces of a dark puzzle, and the more Kate read, the more her stomach churned at the implication of what she was discovering. That falsification was not just an isolated error, an administrative failure lost in time. The name McGregor appeared among the records, and that changed everything. Her heart beat fast as her eyes scanned the signature marked on the aged paper, a handwriting that carried historical weight. Someone from the McGregor family was involved in the acquisition of the adulterated piece, and there was no longer any doubt that it went far beyond a simple oversight by the museum. What once seemed like a case of neglect now took on even greater proportions, and Kate felt every cell in her body screaming at her to do something with that newfound truth. But who to tell? To whom can we entrust this revelation? The answer came before he could even consider the possibilities, when the office door opened with a hit strong enough to make the sheets on the table flutter. William McGregor entered like a storm about to devastate everything around. The biting gleam in his eyes and the shoulders tensed under the dark fabric of the suit gave away that he already knew. He stood in front of the desk, staring at the exposed documents as if they were pure poison, and then stared at her, his voice charged with suppressed fury as he said he hoped she had a good reason to be digging through files that didn't concern him. Kate didn't back down. He felt the blood pulsing in his temples, the air becoming heavy between them, but he kept his posture firm when he replied that those documents concerned everyone, especially him. William closed his eyes for a brief second, taking a deep breath as if trying to contain something about to escape. When he looked at her again, there was something different there, something that made the air between them vibrate in a dangerous way. He asked her if she had any idea what it meant to bring it to light, if she understood the consequences of destroying a legacy built centuries ago by a past mistake. Kate felt her heart tighten, but not from guilt, but from frustration. How could he still see everything only through the prism of his family, of his reputation, while she saw the naked truth, waiting to be revealed? She responded firmly, saying that this was not about him, nor about the McGregor name, but about justice. William gave a short, humorless laugh, his voice charged with bitterness when he asked her if she really believed that it was that simple, that the truth alone was enough to fix the world. He moved closer, each step shrinking the space between the two until Kate felt his presence as a magnetic field around her. He said that the truth does not always set you free, sometimes it destroys everything you fought for, sometimes it does not compensate for the damage it causes. Kate swallowed, because the closeness between them was stifling, but no more than the intensity of what they were saying. She replied without looking away, stating that he was afraid. William laughed again, but this time there was something else there, an exhaustion that Kate didn't expect to see. He said that she knew nothing about fear, that she never had to carry the weight of a name that signifies more than just an identity, but an empire, a symbol, a responsibility that cannot simply be erased by scandal. Kate felt her anger boil over, her chest rising and falling fast as she countered that he didn't want to protect anyone but himself, that all that mattered to him was to keep the illusion of perfection intact. The explosion was inevitable. One moment they were arguing, voices raised in the silent space, words sharp as blades exchanged without hesitation, and the next moment the silence cut through the air like a well-aimed blow. William looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time, and then, before either of them could process what was about to happen, he pulled her by the back of the neck and kissed her. The shock ran down Kate's spine like liquid fire. The warmth of his body, the firmness of his hands holding her in place, the taste of anger and desire mixed in a single gesture. It was a furious, uncontrolled kiss, loaded with everything they had tried to ignore up to that moment. She felt his fingers tighten against her skin, as if she was holding something she knew she should let go but couldn't. Time seemed to stop, and for a brief instant, she allowed that to happen, that stolen moment to exist in the middle of the war they were waging. But then, as abruptly as it began, William walked away. His breath was choppy, his eyes shining with something Kate couldn't fully decipher. He took a step back, as if he needed to pull away to regain control, and then said, in a low, almost harsh tone, that it meant nothing. Kate felt something inside her shatter when she heard those words. She took a deep breath, trying to erase the sensation of his lips on hers, trying to stifle the wave of conflicting emotions that threatened to drown her. He only said that if that was how he wanted to look at it, then maybe he was more of a coward than he imagined. William did not answer. He just turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a trail of something unresolved, something that burned in the air between them and that neither of them knew how to erase. The Edinburgh sky was laden with dense clouds as Kate hurried through the halls of the museum, feeling the chill of the marble beneath her determined footsteps. Her chest still burned with the memory of what had happened the night before, of William's taste, of the warmth of his hands holding her with an urgency that bordered on despair. But all of that had been swept away by the ice of his words, by the way he walked away as if nothing had happened, as if they could just erase what they felt. And now, there, in the face of an investigation that seemed to have reached a dead end, Kate knew there was something much bigger that she needed to solve first. She needed to get out of that game before it was too late. In the main office, William kept his gaze fixed on the documents scattered on the table, but nothing he read made sense. The evidence was there, the names, the records, the evidence that someone within the administration had placed that forgery in the museum's collection and that his own surname was linked to it. But it was Kate's absence that morning that bothered him more than any discovery. He was sure that she would appear, that she would come back to fight him once more, that she would shoot sharp words like daggers to force him to face the truth. But the silence of the museum that morning seemed like a confirmation that something had changed, that perhaps Kate Sinclair was about to leave. She arrived before he could decide whether to look for her. The door opened with a firm movement, and Kate entered the office without hesitation, her expression charged with something resolute. He immediately noticed that something was different, something in the posture, in the way she stared at him without the same usual fury, but with a dangerous calm, a kind of coldness that he didn't want to see. She said that it didn't make sense to stay there anymore, that if he was determined to keep secrets, then she couldn't waste her time trying to convince him otherwise. William felt a tightness in his chest that he could not name and asked if it meant that she was giving up. Kate let out a short, humorless laugh, saying that it wasn't giving up, it was just accepting what was in front of her. He would never choose the truth if it meant risking his own reputation. William stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on her as if trying to decipher her, as if looking for some hesitation that would give him time to stop her. He said that perhaps she did not understand that not everything was as simple as right and wrong, that some truths were more destructive than any lie. Kate crossed her arms, her heart pounding but keeping her voice steady as she asked if he could sleep at night knowing that he would rather hide the truth than face it. William took a deep breath, looking away for a second before saying that some things needed to be protected, not out of cowardice, but because the truth didn't fix everything, sometimes it just left ruins in place. Kate felt the disappointment settle inside her, a bitter taste she didn't expect to feel. She nodded slowly, absorbing those words as a final blow, and said there was nothing more to be done. But as he turned to leave, he felt his arm being held in a sudden motion, the skin burning under his touch. William pulled her back, not with brutality, but with an intensity that made the air vibrate around them. Kate stared into his eyes, and for the first time she saw something there that wasn't arrogance, or anger, or control. It was fear. He said he didn't want her to leave. Kate felt her breath fail for a moment, because that confession, spoken in a low, almost painful tone, was not something she expected to hear. But then William continued, saying that she knocked him off track, that her presence was a complication he didn't know how to handle, but that somehow he couldn't ignore. Kate felt frustration mixed with desire grow inside her, because that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for him to want her to stay if he was never willing to really choose anything other than his own pride. She opened her mouth to answer, but William stepped forward, crossing the distance between them in a determined motion, holding her face with his warm, hungry hands and kissing her as if he desperately needed it to breathe. Unlike the first kiss, this one didn't come from anger, it wasn't an impulsive lapse from a heated argument. This came from necessity, from the silent admission that neither of them could resist anymore. Kate felt his fingers intertwine in her hair, his mouth moving against hers as if she wanted to memorize every detail, as if she wanted to mark that moment on her own skin. She did not resist. He responded to the kiss with the same intensity, feeling her body mold to his, feeling the world around her disappear as the heat took over everything. But then, the moment Kate slid her fingers down the back of his neck, feeling the tension in his muscles, William backed away. It was abrupt, as if an alarm had sounded inside him, as if reality hit him hard. He pulled back just enough for Kate to see the conflict on his face, the way his eyes sparkled with something he was desperately trying to erase. He said that it didn't change anything. Kate felt her chest tighten, frustration mixed with the pain of something breaking inside her. He could say it as many times as he wanted, but he couldn't erase what happened, he couldn't pretend he didn't want it as much as she did. But if he wasn't willing to admit it, then maybe it was time for her to finally accept it. Kate took a deep breath, trying to contain the wave of emotions that threatened to suffocate her, and said only that then it was better for him to let her go. William did not answer. He just stood there as she walked out the door without looking back. But the instant Kate disappeared from sight, he closed his eyes and realized that something inside him had changed forever. The biting wind from Edinburgh blew hard that night, bringing with it a chill that seemed to seep into Kate's bones as she walked through the gates of the McGregor Museum of Art and History for the last time. Or, at least, that's what she wanted to believe. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the decision he had made pressing down on his shoulders like an inevitable burden. She had gathered all the evidence. The doctored documents, records, restoration reports. The connection was clear, as evident as the anger that simmered in his blood. The forgery was not an administrative error. It was a deliberate fraud, masterminded by someone influential within the museum's administration. And now, finally, she knew who was behind it. The papers in his bag seemed to weigh tons, each of them a sentence for the museum's reputation and, more than that, for the McGregor family. The name printed on the records was a shock, and at the same time, it was not. Kate had been suspicious, but seeing the confirmation before her eyes brought a bitter taste to her mouth. Graham Whitmore. The man who, for decades, had been at the side of the McGregor family, a longtime investor, a close friend of William's father, one of those responsible for keeping the museum's empire intact. Not only did he approve the acquisition of the counterfeit piece, but he also covered up suspicious transactions that went far beyond that painting. Kate knew that this was bigger than any academic article, bigger than any archaeological study. It was a direct blow to the integrity of the McGregor Museum. It was a scandal waiting to explode. And more than anyone, William McGregor needed to know that. His office was lit up when Kate walked in without hesitation, tossing the documents onto the table with a hit that sent a few leaves scattering across the dark mahogany. William, who had been standing by the window until then, his distant gaze turned to the illuminated city, turned slowly. His blue eyes met hers, loaded with something Kate couldn't decipher right away. Exhaustion? Anticipation? Or just the certainty that that moment would come? She said that there was everything, every detail, every piece of evidence that connected Graham Whitmore to the forgery and fraudulent transactions inside the museum. William remained silent for a long moment before walking over to the table and picking up one of the papers with careful fingers, his eyes darting through the information as if he needed time to absorb what he already knew he would find. He scrolled through the pages slowly, but Kate noticed the tension in his shoulders, the jaw muscle contracting as he processed each line. Then, without looking up, he said that it could not be made public. Kate felt the air escape from her lungs as if she had been hit. She stepped forward, her voice charged with incredulity as she asked him if he was serious, if he really intended to cover it all up. William looked up, and what Kate saw in them made something inside her break. He wasn't denying the facts, he wasn't disputing the truth. He knew. Maybe he had known for longer than she imagined. And yet he was choosing silence. He said it wasn't that simple, that destroying Graham Whitmore meant destroying the museum. Kate laughed, a short, humorless laugh, frustration simmering under her skin as she asked him if he really believed he could live carrying this weight, knowing he was protecting a criminal. William looked away from the documents, holding one of the sheets between his fingers, his distant gaze as if he could see beyond the printed words. He said the museum was more than a building, more than a collection of artifacts. It was the history of his family, it was the legacy of his father, his mother, of generations who built it with their own hands. If that came to light, everything would fall apart. Kate felt the anger being replaced by something deeper. Disappointment. Not because he wants to protect the museum, but because, in the end, he was willing to sacrifice everything, including his own conscience, to keep something that was already rotten inside. She moved one step closer, her voice now low, controlled, but loaded with pain as she asked if he really thought he could go on living like this, knowing the truth and choosing to ignore it. William closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and when he looked at her again, there was a tiredness there that she had never seen before. He said that if she wanted to expose everything, he wouldn't stop her. But it wouldn't help her either. Kate felt her chest tighten, because those words were more painful than anything he could have said. He was giving up. Not from the museum, not from the truth. But theirs. That realization hurt more than any blow, more than any discussion they had had. She felt her eyes burn, but she wouldn't allow him to see. He took a deep breath, picked up the papers on the table with quick and precise gestures and said that there was nothing more to be said. If he wanted to live with that choice, then let him live. But she wouldn't stay to watch it. William did not stop her. He just stood there as Kate turned and walked out of the office, her footsteps echoing down the silent hallway. But the moment she walked through the door of the museum and felt the cold wind against her skin, she knew that something inside her would never be the same again. And, at the top of that building, alone in his office, William also knew. The rain fell incessantly on Edinburgh, thin and sharp, turning the cobblestone streets into wet mirrors that reflected the lights of the streetlights. From the top of the McGregor Museum of Art and History, William watched the city with a blank expression, his eyes locked on some distant spot he couldn't really see. The cold glass under his fingers condensed slightly with the warmth of his skin, and for a moment, he wondered how long it had been since Kate had walked out the door of that museum. Hours? Days? It didn't matter. Time had lost its meaning since she was gone. The pile of documents was still on his desk, untouched since that night. The evidence was there, each leaf loaded with the weight of a truth he had spent his life trying to avoid. For years, his existence was shaped by his unwavering commitment to the museum, to the McGregor name, to the legacy that his father and mother left him. From a young age, he learned that his duty was to protect that history at any cost, that the museum's reputation was worth more than any moral dilemma. But now, for the first time, he wondered if all this effort served anything other than turning him into a prisoner of his own choices. He tried to justify to himself that he had done what was right, that keeping the scandal buried was not cowardice, but protection. But if it was true, then why did everything inside him seem to be falling apart? He stepped away from the window, picking up one of the papers and scrolling through the familiar lines once more. Graham Whitmore's name stared back at him, impassively, as if to challenge his hesitation. William felt the rage rise like a violent wave, not only against Graham, but against himself. How many times had he turned a blind eye to the corruption within the museum just to preserve what he believed to be his heritage? How many lies have been swallowed for fear of the consequences? And most of all, why did he feel that by losing Kate, he also lost the last part of himself that he still believed could be different? The answer came in an instant of brutal clarity. He couldn't go on like this. He could not spend the rest of his life keeping alive a castle built on quicksand. And most of all, he couldn't go on ignoring the fact that in trying to protect everything he thought mattered, he destroyed the only thing that really mattered. The next morning, the newspapers were in an uproar. Headlines dominated websites and specialized magazines, announcing something that no one expected. McGregor Museum admits to forgery scandal and internal corruption. William McGregor denounces historical partner and exposes irregularities within the museum itself. The words seemed impossible to associate with his name, the man who had spent his entire life protecting that institution as if it were part of himself. But there he was, sitting in front of a press conference, the flashes of cameras exploding around him, his voice steady and collected as he said that the truth must always prevail, regardless of the cost. Kate saw it all from afar. Sitting in the cafe of a downtown bookstore, she held her phone tightly, her heart racing as she watched the live broadcast. William was there, in front of everyone, doing exactly what she never imagined he would have the courage to do. He wasn't just admitting what had been hidden, he was pitting himself against those who were once allies, against the very structure that sustained his legacy. He was risking everything. And deep down, she knew that this wasn't just about justice. She looked away from the screen for a moment, trying to process what she felt. For days, he convinced himself that he made the right choice when he left. She told herself that William would never change, that he was too attached to his own pride to see beyond what he wanted to preserve. But now, there, in front of that version of him that seemed to have finally broken its chains, she realized what she had really lost. She spent so much time trying to get him to see the truth that she never considered what would happen if he actually saw it. And now that he could see, she didn't know if there was still a way back. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a silvery glow over the cobblestone streets of Edinburgh. The streetlights cast soft reflections on the puddles, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth mixed with the sweet aroma of coffee coming from the small shops that still remained open. Kate walked slowly, feeling the weight of each step as she approached the place she swore never to set foot again. The McGregor Museum of Art and History loomed before him, imposing as ever, but there was something different now, something that made his heart beat faster and his hands grow cold. She shouldn't be there. He was already gone. He had already left everything behind. But then why, the moment he saw William expound the truth, did he feel he couldn't ignore what it meant? The interior of the museum was quiet when she entered. The soft lighting highlighted the curves of the sculptures, the contours of the paintings, the marks of history that place carried. But Kate wasn't interested in art at the time. His gaze was looking for only one thing, only one person. And then, at the end of the main hallway, near the wing that had once been the epicenter of the scandal, she saw him. William had his back to her, standing in front of one of the large windows, his hands in the pockets of his dark coat. The reflection of the glass showed a glimpse of his expression, a lost, distant look, as if he wasn't sure how he had gotten there either. Kate hesitated for a moment, but then, before she could decide if she should stay, William turned slowly. His eyes met hers, and time seemed to stand still. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched her, as if he wanted to make sure that she was real, that she wasn't just another memory that her mind insisted on conjuring. Then, finally, he broke the silence, saying that he didn't expect to see her there. Kate took a deep breath before answering that she didn't expect to return either. But she had returned. William let out a slow sigh, running his hand through his hair as if he needed time to organize his thoughts before speaking. He said he spent his whole life trying to be the man his father hoped he would be, that his family demanded him to be, that the museum needed him to be. But for the first time, he realized that he might have spent so much time trying to preserve something that was already broken that he didn't realize what really mattered. Kate felt a tightness in her chest, because that was the confession she had waited to hear for so long, and now that she heard it, she didn't know what to do with it. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on hers, his voice low and heavy with a weight that made his heart waver as he said he tried to fight it, tried to resist her, but failed. Kate felt her throat close, because part of her wanted to believe, wanted to accept every word, but another part still feared that everything would fall apart again. She said she never wanted to destroy him, that she never wanted him to choose between the truth and the museum, between her and her story. I just wanted him to see that he could be more than a name and a legacy, that he could be a free man. William smiled, a small, barely noticeable smile, but loaded with something Kate had never seen before. He said that for the first time, he felt that maybe it could be. The silence between them was different now. There was no more anger, there was no more war. Just two people who had gotten lost on the way and who were now trying to find each other again. William raised his hand slowly, hesitantly, as if he expected her to back off, but Kate didn't back down. When his fingers touched her face, she felt the heat spread across her skin, felt the weight of the moment sink her, pull her close. And then he kissed her. This time, there was no urgency, there was no despair, there was no fear. Just the certainty that, no matter how much they had fought against it, no matter how much they had tried to deny it, they would always end up there, in each other. Kate felt William's arms tighten her waist, felt herself being pulled close as if he never wanted to let go of her. And maybe he really didn't. The rain fell again as they left the museum, choppy breaths, low laughter between looks that said everything they still needed to say. The streets of Edinburgh glistened in the light of streetlights, and the wind carried silent promises in the air. Kate looked at William and knew that from then on, everything would be different. And William, as he looked at Kate, knew that he had finally found what he had spent his whole life trying to protect. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Happiness of Love. That way, you won't miss any of our heartfelt romances. See you in the next love story.